Every Monday morning, Lieutenant Kimberly Dawson walked into the same quiet nurses' station on Ward C, and every Monday morning, she found something waiting for her that no one could explain. Flowers. Wild flowers, tied with plain string, sitting on the corner of her desk before her coffee had even gone cold. No card, no name, no camera footage that ever caught the person who left them. At first, she told herself someone was simply being kind. A grateful patient's family, maybe. Or a soldier she'd helped who didn't know how else to say thank you. But weeks turned into months, and the flowers kept coming, and the questions kept piling up faster than the answers. She asked the front desk. She asked security. She asked every nurse and every visitor she could think of. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had seen a thing. Then came the notes. Short, unsigned. Written in careful, old-fashioned handwriting that looked like it belonged to another era entirely. The kind of penmanship nobody really learned anymore. Each one said something quiet and specific about her, like whoever was writing them had been watching her far longer and far more closely than she'd ever imagined. She might never have learned the truth at all, if not for one elderly veteran, sitting in a hospital lobby with a crossword puzzle, who happened to glance down at a dropped note and go pale. Because he recognized the handwriting. It belonged to a man who had been dead for over 40 years. What Lieutenant Dawson uncovered next wasn't a mystery about her at all. It was a promise made on a battlefield in 1968. A promise one soldier never got the chance to keep, and one that had been quietly, painfully waiting, for 4 decades, for somebody brave enough to finally finish it. The clock on the wall read 6:47 when Lieutenant Kimberly Dawson unlocked the door to the nurses' station on Ward C, balancing a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm on her drive in. She flipped on the lights, dropped her bag on the chair, and stopped. There, on the corner of her desk, sat a small bundle of wildflowers, black-eyed Susans and a few sprigs of something purple she didn't recognize, tied together with plain kitchen string. No vase, no card, no name. She looked around the empty station, then out toward the hallway, where the overnight shift nurse, a woman named Rosalind, was just finishing her rounds. "Hey," Kimberly called. "These yours?" Rosalind glanced over, shrugged. "Wasn't me. Figured maybe a patient's family left them for you." Kimberly turned the flowers over in her hands, half expecting a note to fall out. There wasn't one. She set them in a paper cup filled with water, more out of habit than sentiment, and got on with her morning. Medication rounds, vitals, the quiet choreography of a rehabilitation ward waking up. She didn't think about the flowers again until they wilted 3 days later, and she threw them out without ceremony. Ward C at Fitzsimmons Military Rehabilitation Hospital was not a place that dealt in mysteries. It dealt in the slow, unglamorous work of putting people back together. Soldiers relearning how to grip a fork with a hand that no longer worked the way it used to. Men and women staring at ceiling tiles at 3 a.m. because sleep wouldn't come. Families sitting in hard plastic chairs trying to recognize the son or husband who'd come home changed. Kimberly had worked the ward for 4 years. She was 29, though the fatigue behind her eyes sometimes made her look older, and the quiet steadiness in her voice sometimes made her sound like she'd been doing this for 20. She'd been passed over for charge nurse 18 months ago. The job had gone to someone with less time on the floor but better timing, and she'd said nothing about it, because saying something never seemed to change anything, only cost you something in the process. Her personal life had the shape of a room nobody had bothered to furnish. There had been a fiancé once, before her second overseas rotation. There hadn't been much of anyone since. She told herself she didn't mind. Most days, that was even true. What she did mind, what she carried home some nights, was Corporal Whitfield in room 214, who hadn't spoken more than 4 words to anyone in a week. Or the Silva family who'd stopped visiting because watching their father not recognize them had become harder than not seeing him at all. She minded the parts of the job nobody put in the recruiting brochures. So when the flowers appeared again the following Monday, same bundle, same string, same undisclosed origin, She noticed, but didn't have the bandwidth to be curious about it. She assumed, reasonably, that someone had simply been kind to her once and decided to make it a habit. A grateful patient's wife, maybe. A discharged soldier's mother. It was the third Monday that made her pause, because this time, tucked beneath the string, there was a small square of paper, folded once. She opened it carefully, expecting a name. You still do the work right. That matters more than anyone tells you. No signature, no initials. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who'd learned to write before computers made it optional. Kimberly read it twice, then folded it back along its crease and slipped it into the pocket of her scrubs, where it sat like a small stone all through her shift. She asked around, gently, over the following days. The front desk staff hadn't seen anyone. Security had no memory of an unfamiliar visitor lingering near Ward C on a Monday morning. Though the cameras covering the nurses' station, she learned when she finally worked up the nerve to ask facilities to check, had a gap in coverage those exact mornings, chalked up to a maintenance issue nobody could quite explain. Probably nothing, said the facilities tech, a heavy-set man named Ortiz, scratching the back of his neck. Systems older than the building half the time. Kimberly nodded like she believed him. She told herself it didn't matter. Someone was being kind to her, anonymously, and there were worse things in the world than that. But some nights, driving home past the edge of base housing, she found herself running through the short list of who it could be, and coming up empty every time. Not a patient. The timing didn't fit anyone's visiting hours. Not staff. She'd have noticed someone watching the desk closely enough to know her exact schedule, which meant someone was watching closely enough to know it anyway, and choosing deliberately not to be seen. That was the part that stayed with her. Not fear, exactly. Something quieter than fear. The sense of being noticed by someone who had decided, for reasons of his own, that being invisible mattered more than being thanked. She didn't know yet that the answer had already been walking the halls of the hospital for 2 years. She didn't know that the handwriting on that note would, in a matter of weeks, stop an old man's heart cold in a waiting room 3 floors down. All she knew, that Monday night, was that somebody out there had decided she was worth watching and worth remembering, and she had absolutely no idea why. By the 6th week, the flowers had become something Kimberly didn't mention out loud anymore. Not because she'd stopped noticing them, but because she'd run out of ways to bring it up without sounding like she was asking for attention. Rosalind had stopped joking about it. The other nurses had moved on to speculating about the new charge nurses' coffee habits instead. Only Kimberly still checked her desk first thing every Monday, before her coat was even off, with something between hope and unease sitting in her chest. The notes kept coming too, though not every week, and never anything long. A line here, a line there. Some people don't get thanked enough for showing up. You show up. The ones who don't say much are usually carrying the most. She'd started keeping them in the inside pocket of her jacket instead of throwing them out, though she couldn't have said exactly why. It wasn't romantic. The tone was wrong for that. Too plain, too aged in its phrasing, like something written by a man who'd learned courtesy from a different era. It felt less like flirtation and more like witness, like someone was keeping score of her decency, quietly, from somewhere she couldn't see. She ran the security footage gap by Ortiz a second time and got the same shrug. She asked the hospital chaplain, on a hunch, if any of the regular visiting families had ever mentioned her by name. He said no, but promised to keep an ear out. She was, for the first time in a long while, genuinely stumped by something that wasn't a chart or a diagnosis, and she didn't like how much space it was taking up in her head. It was easier some days to put the mystery aside and focus on Corporal Eli Marsh. Marsh had come to Ward C 8 weeks earlier with a shattered femur, 2 fingers he'd never fully bend again, and a silence that worried Kimberly more than any of his physical injuries. He'd been the only survivor pulled from a vehicle outside Kandahar. He didn't talk about the other 3. He barely talked about anything. "You don't have to tell me what happened," Kimberly said to him one afternoon. adjusting the tension on his leg brace while he stared at the ceiling with the particular blankness of a man doing math he didn't want to finish. "But you do have to eat something today. That's not negotiable." "Why do you care?" Marsh said. "Not really a question." "Because it's my job." A pause. "And because I don't think you believe you deserve anyone caring right now, and I think that's a lie you're telling yourself, and I'd rather you didn't get too comfortable with it." He didn't answer. But 3 days later, for the first time since he'd arrived, he asked her a question that wasn't about his prognosis. He asked if she'd ever lost anyone. She told him, briefly and honestly, about her father, career army, a man she'd spent her whole childhood trying to get the attention of and had only really understood after he was gone. It wasn't a therapy session, it wasn't meant to be. But something in Marsh's face loosened, just slightly, like a man setting down a weight he hadn't realized he was still carrying. It was, Kimberly would think later, one of the better days of that whole strange month. The kind of day that reminded her why she'd stayed in this job even after being passed over, even after the fiancé, even after all the nights that asked more of her than she had left to give. The note that changed things came on a Monday in late October, tucked under the string of a small bundle of goldenrod, the paper slightly damp from morning dew, like it had sat outside longer than the others. "For keeping your word to those who can't keep it themselves." Kimberly read it standing at her desk, coat still half-buttoned, and felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. The other notes had been about her, gentle, observational, the kind of thing a grateful stranger might write. This one wasn't about her at all. It was about a promise. Someone else's promise. Worded like it belonged to a conversation she wasn't part of. Addressed to her only because she happened to be standing where it needed to land. She sat with it for a long moment, then folded it into her jacket pocket with the others, feeling, for the first time since this started, not touched, but unsettled. Whoever was leaving these wasn't just noticing her. He was working through something, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with wildflowers, and everything to do with a debt he hadn't yet found a way to pay. Walter Higgins had not planned on noticing anything that Thursday afternoon. He was 83 years old, moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees had opinions about every step, and he was only in the lobby of Fitzsimmons because his granddaughter Renee had asked him to sit with her while the physical therapist finished a session with her husband, a young sergeant recovering from a spinal injury 2 floors up. Walter had brought a crossword. He did the crossword everywhere now. Waiting rooms, church, the barber shop. Because it gave his hands something to do and his mind something to chew on, besides the things it usually chewed on. Late at night, when the house was quiet and his wife had been gone 11 years. Kimberly happened to sit 2 chairs down from him, filling out a supply requisition form on her lunch break, her jacket draped over her lap. When she leaned over to pick up a dropped pen, one of the folded notes slipped out of her pocket and landed, open, on the floor between them. Walter reached for it before she did, reflex more than intention, and held it out to her. Then he stopped. His eyes moved over the handwriting, and something in his face changed so completely that Kimberly noticed before he said a single word. The color didn't drain from him so much as retreat, all at once, like a tide pulling back from a shore. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice had gone flat, careful, the way a man's voice goes when he's trying very hard not to sound as shaken as he is. "Sir, this note." He hadn't let go of it. "Where did it come from?" Kimberly set down her pen. "Someone's been leaving me flowers, for months now. This came with one of them. I don't know who it's from. I've asked everyone I can think of." She studied him. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the note like it might rearrange itself into something less impossible if he stared long enough. "I knew a man," he finally said, "who wrote like this." Every letter closed up tight, like he didn't trust himself to leave gaps. Wrote that way in every letter he ever sent home. He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet in a way that embarrassed him. She could see him fighting it. His name was Thomas Reyes. We served together, Vietnam, 1968. Kimberly felt something cold move through her, though she couldn't have said why yet. "That's a long time ago, sir. Longer than you know." He handed the note back to her like it had gotten heavier in his hands. "Thomas Reyes has been dead for over 40 years. Renee found them still sitting there 20 minutes later, her grandfather uncharacteristically pale, the crossword abandoned on the seat beside him. She asked if he was all right, and Walter said yes in the automatic way people say yes when they very much are not. And Kimberly, against every instinct telling her to let a fragile old man alone with whatever memory she'd just disturbed, asked gently if she might come back and talk to him again, properly, when he had time. Walter looked at her for a long moment. "I made him a promise," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "Before he died, and I didn't keep it the way I should have." He shook his head, more to himself than to her. "I thought that was buried with him. I didn't think—" He stopped, gestured vaguely at the note still in her hand, unable to finish the sentence. "Sir, whoever's leaving these, the handwriting could just be similar. It doesn't necessarily mean—" "I know his hand, Lieutenant." There was no anger in it, only certainty. The specific certainty of a man who had read a dead friend's letters so many times in the years since that the shape of the words had become permanent behind his eyes. "I know it the way you know your own mother's voice on the phone. That is Thomas's hand, or it's someone who learned to write from watching him do it." Renee, alarmed now, asked what was going on, and Walter waved her off gently, telling her it was an old story, nothing to worry about, though the tremor in his hand when he reached for his cane said otherwise. Kimberly watched him go, moving slower than he had an hour before, like the conversation itself had cost him something physical. She stood in the lobby a long while after he'd gone, the note still open in her palm, aware of two things with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. The first was that whatever this was, it was bigger and older than a shy admirer, too nervous to sign his name. The second was that Walter Higgins did not look like a man who had years left to wait for an answer, and if she was going to find one, it would have to be soon. Kimberly didn't sleep well that night, and she didn't try to pretend otherwise. She lay awake running through what Walter had said. A promise made in 1968, a debt he'd never settled, a dead man's handwriting showing up on flowers left for a nurse who'd never heard the name Thomas Reyes before that Thursday. None of it made sense as a straight line. But she'd learned, over years of reading charts that didn't add up until you found the one detail nobody had bothered to mention, that mysteries usually had an ordinary explanation sitting somewhere in plain sight. She started, the next morning, with the hospital's own records, not out of any real plan, just instinct. Personnel files, volunteer logs, anyone connected to Ward C who'd started around the time the flowers began. Human Resources wouldn't hand over personnel files to a nurse on a hunch, and she knew better than to ask outright. So she asked smaller questions instead. She asked the facilities office how long Ortiz's team had been short-staffed. She asked the volunteer coordinator, an easygoing woman named Pat, whether any new maintenance or ground staff had come on in the last 2 years. Pat didn't even have to check her list. "Daniel," she said. "Started. Must be almost 2 years now. Quiet fellow. Keeps to himself, does good work. Why?" Kimberly kept her voice even. "Just wondering. Which building's he usually in? Bounces around. Spends a lot of time over in C, actually, now that you mention it." It took her another 2 days to work up the nerve to actually watch for him, and when she did, she felt almost foolish about it. A grown woman staking out a maintenance closet like she was solving a crime instead of just asking someone a direct question. But something told her that whatever this was, it wasn't going to survive being asked about directly. Not yet. Daniel Reyes turned out to be a soft-spoken man somewhere in his 50s, gray coming in at the temples, with the kind of careful, unhurried competence that made him easy to overlook in a building full of louder people. Kimberly found him replacing ceiling tiles near the west stairwell on a Wednesday afternoon, and stood there a moment longer than was natural before she spoke. "Mr. Reyes?" He looked down from the ladder, polite, unbothered. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Lieutenant Dawson, Ward C. She held up the folded note, the same one Walter had gone pale over, close enough for him to see the handwriting, but not close enough to read the words. "I was hoping you might recognize this." Something happened in Daniel Reyes's face that she'd now seen twice in 1 week. The particular stillness of a man realizing a private thing had stopped being private. He climbed down slowly, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and didn't reach for the note. "That's my handwriting," he said. Not exactly. I practiced it. My father's hand. I learned it off his old letters when I was a kid, wrote it out so many times it just became mine too." He met her eyes, and there was no deception in it. Only a kind of tired relief, like a man finally setting down something he'd been carrying alone for a long time. His name was Thomas Reyes. They talked for nearly an hour, sitting on 2 overturned equipment buckets in the empty stairwell, Daniel's tools forgotten beside him. He told her his father had died in Vietnam before Daniel turned 3, that he had almost no memories of the man, only letters, photographs, and the stories his mother told before she passed. Stories that got shorter and sadder every year until there was almost nothing left to tell. He told her he'd taken the maintenance job at Fitzsimmons 2 years ago. Not by accident, but on purpose, because Renee, Walter Higgins's granddaughter, was married to a soldier being treated there, and because Walter himself came by often enough that Daniel had, for 2 years, been quietly watching a man he believed owed his family something, without ever working up the courage to say a word to him. "I wasn't trying to punish him," Daniel said, when Kimberly asked gently why the silence instead of a conversation. "I don't even know what I wanted from him. I started leaving flowers for you because you reminded me of the kind of care my father would have wanted for the men here. It wasn't really about you at all, I'm sorry to say. It was about him, about giving something to this place instead of just standing in it angry." Kimberly sat with that for a long moment. She understood now, more than she wished she did. The weight of a grief with nowhere to go. The strange logic of anonymous kindness as a way of managing something too large to say out loud. "He recognized the handwriting," she said finally. "Walter did. He's been shaken ever since." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I know who he is. I've known for 2 years. He's not well, Mr. Reyes. I don't think he has 40 more years to figure out how to say what he needs to say to you." She held his gaze, steady, the same steadiness she used on frightened patients who needed the truth more than comfort. "I'm not asking you to forgive anybody. I'm asking if you'd be willing to sit in a room with him before it's too late for either of you to get anything out of it." Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring at the tools by his feet like they might answer for him. "I don't know if I can," he said finally. "I've spent 30 years being angry at a man I've never even spoken to. I don't know what's left of me without that." He picked up his tools and went back to work, and Kimberly let him, understanding that some doors didn't open on the first knock, and that if this one was going to open at all, it would take more than a single conversation in a stairwell to do it. Kimberly didn't push again for 3 days. She'd learned enough, over years of sitting with frightened patients, to know that some things couldn't be pulled loose. They had to be given in their own time, or not at all. So she waited, and she checked on Walter through Renee, who reported that her grandfather had barely slept since the lobby, that he kept asking about the young lieutenant and whether she'd learned anything more. It was Daniel who came to her, in the end. He found her at the nurse's station on a Thursday morning, still in his coveralls, turning his cap over in his hands like a man unused to asking for anything. "If he's willing," Daniel said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'll sit with him. Once. I'm not promising anything past that." Kimberly nodded, careful not to let her relief show too plainly. "That's enough. That's more than enough." She arranged it for the following Monday, in the small family consultation room down the hall from Ward C, neutral ground, quiet, away from the noise of the main lobby. She told Walter only that someone wanted to meet him, someone connected to Thomas. She told Daniel only that Walter had agreed, and that he owed Daniel nothing except the truth, whatever that turned out to be. She almost didn't believe either of them would show up until she saw them, 10 minutes apart, walking the same hallway toward the same door. Walter arrived first, moving slower than usual, his cane tapping an uneven rhythm against the tile. He sat, folded his hands, and waited with the particular stillness of a man bracing for a verdict. Daniel came a few minutes later, pausing in the doorway long enough that Kimberly wondered if he might turn around. He didn't. He sat across from Walter, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. It was Walter who broke first. "You have his eyes," he said quietly. "I should have known the moment I saw you around this place. I just never let myself look close enough. You knew who I was. I knew who you had to be. The day I heard your last name at the front desk 2 years back, I told myself it wasn't my business to go looking." Walter's hands tightened around his cane. "That was a lie I told myself so I wouldn't have to do the harder thing." Daniel's jaw worked. "The harder thing being what, exactly?" "Facing you." Walter's voice cracked, just slightly, and he let it. "I promised your father, the night before the ambush that killed him, that if he didn't make it home, I'd look after his family. Make sure you and your mother never wanted for anything. I meant it with everything I had in me." He stopped, gathered himself. "And then I came home broken in ways I didn't have words for back then, and I went to see your mother exactly once, when you were maybe 4 years old, and she was so raw with grief she could barely look at me, and I took that as my answer. I told myself she didn't want the reminder. I told myself I was doing her a kindness by staying away." "You told yourself a lot of things," Daniel said, and there was real anger in it now, 30 years of it, finally given somewhere to go. "I did." Walter didn't flinch from it. "I've told myself those things for 40 years because the alternative was admitting I was afraid. Afraid of your mother's grief, afraid of what I owed and couldn't pay, afraid of looking at Thomas's boy and seeing everything I hadn't done. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth, finally, since you've waited long enough to hear it." The room was quiet for a long moment. Kimberly, standing near the door, said nothing, understanding that whatever happened next belonged to the two of them alone. "I used to think," Daniel said finally, "that if I ever met you, I'd want you to suffer for it. Sitting here now, I don't feel that. I just feel tired." He looked up. "I don't know if I can call this forgiveness, but I don't want to carry the other thing anymore either." Walter reached into his coat and drew out a photograph, worn soft at the corners. 3 young soldiers, arms slung over each other's shoulders, squinting into a sun 40 years gone. "This was taken 2 weeks before he died," he said, sliding it across the table. "I've carried it every day since. I think it's time it belonged to you instead." Daniel took it with both hands, the way a man takes something he isn't sure he's ready for. Word got around the ward slowly, in the careful, respectful way that real things travel among people who understand grief when they see it. Daniel Reyes kept working at Fitzsimmons, no longer hiding behind quiet errands and unsigned notes. Walter's health continued its slow decline, but Renee said he seemed lighter after that Monday, like something long overdue had finally been set down. Kimberly went home that night and, for the first time in years, took out the one photograph she had of her own father in uniform, young and unreadable, a man she'd spent her whole life trying to understand and had only started to, in earnest, after he was gone. She didn't know if she'd ever fully close that particular distance, but she understood now, something she hadn't before, that some promises take decades to keep, and that the keeping of them mattered more than the timing ever could. The following Monday, flowers appeared on her desk again, same as always. This time, Daniel didn't wait to be found. He brought them himself, set them down, and said good morning like a man who no longer needed to disappear. And there you have it, the story of Lieutenant Kimberly Dawson, a bundle of mystery flowers, and a 40-year-old promise finally kept. Thank you so much for watching this story to the end. If it moved you, please consider giving it a like and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you soon with another story worth telling.